The smell of sawdust never really leaves a job site. It gets into the fibers of your jacket, settles into the creases of your palms, follows you home on the soles of your boots. Adrienne used to say that Caleb smelled like a lumber yard even after a shower. She said it the way people say things they've decided to be annoyed by. Not because the smell was truly offensive, but because it was evidence. Evidence that he worked with his hands. Evidence that he came home tired, in a way that didn't translate to dinner conversation. Evidence that the man she'd married at 26 was not the man she'd imagined she deserved. Caleb Hurst had been running crews on construction sites across the Greater Toronto area since he was 22 years old. He started as a laborer, the bottom rung, the one who carries things and digs things and stands in the rain holding a surveyor's pole while someone else takes measurements. He didn't complain about it. His father had done the same thing in Newfoundland and his grandfather before that. There was dignity in it as far as Caleb was concerned. Dignity in work that left a mark on the world you could point to and say, "I built that." Adrienne didn't see it that way. She was 29 when they met, working as a project coordinator at a mid-sized development firm in Mississauga. Sharp, organized, the kind of woman who color-coded her calendar and never missed a deadline. They met at a site walkthrough. She was there, representing the client. He was the crew lead who caught a structural error in the framing that would have cost the developer $300,000 to fix after the fact. She'd been impressed by that. Just not impressed enough, it turned out, to stay. They were married for 4 years. The apartment they shared in Hamilton was nice enough. 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, a kitchen with the kind of subway tile backsplash that was in every renovation magazine from 2018 onward. Caleb had installed the tile himself on a long weekend. Adrienne had taken a photo of it for her Instagram. She didn't mention he'd done the work. That detail matters more now than it did then. The cracks, if Adrienne had been paying attention, were hers, not his. She had started measuring her life against the lives of people she saw from a distance. Her manager at the firm, Fletcher, drove a black Range Rover and had a condo on the waterfront in Burlington. He talked about square footage the way other people talked about travel. He had the easy confidence of someone who had never once worried about a water heater failing in January, and Adrienne found herself orbiting him in meetings, listening more carefully than her job required. Caleb noticed he wasn't oblivious. He came home one evening in March, still in his work clothes, and found Adrienne standing at the kitchen counter scrolling through something on her phone. She didn't look up when he came in. He stood there for a moment in the doorway, boots off, jacket over his arm, and something in the quality of her silence told him that the distance between them had become structural. Not just a bad week. Something load-bearing had shifted. He made dinner that night. Pasta with a jarred sauce because he was tired and it was Thursday. Adrienne ate 6 bites, said she wasn't hungry, and went to bed at 9. He washed the dishes and stood at the sink for a while, looking out at the street below. 3 weeks later, she told him she wanted a divorce. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, the one they'd found at an estate sale in Dundas and refinished together, and she folded her hands and said she didn't think they were compatible anymore, that she wanted different things, that she needed someone who had ambition. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "I do have ambition," he said. "I know you think that," she said, which was worse than any argument. The calm of it. The way she said it like she was delivering a performance review rather than ending a marriage. He didn't beg. He didn't yell. He signed the papers 6 weeks later, shook his lawyer's hand, and drove himself home to the new apartment he'd rented near Stony Creek. It was smaller. It smelled like fresh paint and nobody. He ordered Thai food and sat on the floor because the couch hadn't arrived yet and watched something forgettable on his laptop. That was October. By February, Adrienne was with Fletcher. She didn't announce it officially. She never posted about it, not in those early months. But word gets around in industry circles, and Caleb heard it the way you always hear things you weren't supposed to know, sideways, from someone who assumed you already did. He was on a job in Oakville when his site foreman, a third-generation tradesman named Dermot, who had the social tact of a framing nail, said, "Heard your ex is seeing the Fletcher guy. The one from your old firm?" Caleb just nodded and kept reading the load-bearing specs in his hand. "Shame," Dermot said, not unkindly. Is it? Caleb said. Dermot considered this. Probably not, he decided and went back to work. What Dermot didn't know, what almost no one in that world knew, because Caleb had spent 7 years making sure of it, was that Fletcher Crane was not, in any meaningful sense, Caleb's boss. Fletcher was the regional development director at Meridian Group, one of the largest real estate development companies in Ontario. He had a title that implied authority over a significant portfolio. He had a corner office in the Burlington headquarters and an assistant who brought him coffee at 9 and 2. He attended ribbon cuttings and sat on the right-hand side at planning committee meetings. What Fletcher did not have, what he had never had in all the years he'd worked at Meridian, was ownership. Caleb Hurst owned Meridian Group. Not technically, not on any business card, not in any email signature. Meridian was structured through a series of numbered holding companies and a family trust that had been set up by Caleb's uncle, Malcolm, before Malcolm died in 2019 and left the entire portfolio to the only person he'd ever trusted with it. Malcolm had built the company over 40 years, quietly, without ceremony, the same way Caleb built everything, with his hands, with his instincts, with the kind of patience that doesn't photograph well but compounds over time. Caleb had been working on sites since he was a teenager because Malcolm believed you had to understand what you were building from the ground up. Not from a boardroom, not from a spreadsheet, from the site, from the soil, from the way a foundation shifts in wet ground. Malcolm used to say that a developer who had never worked a full day on a site was just a man spending other people's money on things he didn't understand. So Caleb had worked and learned, and when Malcolm got sick and called him up to his house in Collingwood to tell him what was coming, Caleb had sat beside the hospital bed and listened to the plan, the trust, the transition, the careful legal architecture that would transfer control without disruption. You don't want your name on it yet, Malcolm had told him. Let the company run itself for a few years. Let Fletcher run it. He's good at the visible parts. You learn the invisible ones. And then? Caleb had asked. Malcolm had looked at him with those steady gray eyes. And then you step in when it's time. How do I know when it's time? You'll know, he'd said. That conversation had taken place 4 months before Caleb met Adrienne. He had never told her, not because he was hiding it exactly, more that he had learned, early, that money changed the way people looked at you, and he hadn't wanted to find out what kind of person she was before he already knew. By the time he thought he knew her well enough to tell her, he was already watching the cracks form. And then she was gone. Meridian's board knew. The company's legal team knew. A handful of senior people knew, including the CFO, a sharp, understated woman named Dorothea, who had worked with Malcolm for 20 years and treated Caleb's confidentiality requirements with the same professionalism she applied to everything else. Fletcher knew only that the majority shareholder was a trust. He had never met the trustee in a formal capacity. He had never needed to. Caleb had made sure of that. He communicated through lawyers when he needed to communicate at all. He showed up on sites as a senior project manager, a role he genuinely performed, because the work needed doing and because it kept him close to the ground. Adrienne, for her part, had found exactly what she was looking for. Fletcher had taken her to the restaurant at the top of the Shangri-La in Toronto for their third date. He bought her shoes from a store on Bloor Street that didn't have prices on the tags. He took her to a fundraiser gala at Roy Thomson Hall and introduced her to people with hyphenated last names and second homes in the Muskokas. She felt, for the first time in years, like she was living at the altitude she had always been meant for. She posted a photo from the gala. Champagne, chandelier, the edge of Fletcher's jaw. Some nights, she captioned it. 22 friends liked it within the hour. Caleb was not one of them, because Caleb had unfollowed her the week after she left. He was in Fort Erie that week, walking a new site with Dermot, arguing cheerfully about drainage and grade and the particular stubbornness of the clay soil in that part of the province. He didn't miss her. He missed having someone. That's different, and he knew the difference. Spring came to the Niagara Peninsula with the particular ferocity of springs that have been waiting all winter to make a point. The ground thawed fast. The creek behind the Fort Erie site ran brown and high, and Caleb found himself working longer days than he needed to. He liked the longer days. They kept the quiet at bay. He had dinner with Dermot and Dermot's wife, Paulette, on a Friday in April. They had a bungalow outside Grimsby with a propane fire pit and a dog named Birchwood who was obsessed with tennis balls. Paulette made roast chicken and asked Caleb, with the directness of someone who had known him long enough to skip the preamble, whether he was doing all right. Better than expected, he said. That's not the same as good, she said. No, he agreed. But it's better than it was. She refilled his wine and left it at that. It was Dermot who told him, 6 weeks later, that Fletcher had apparently proposed to Adrienne, not with any particular malice. Dermot just passed along information the way a weather report passes along information. Here is what is happening, you can dress accordingly. Caleb thanked him and went back to the drainage specs. That evening, alone in his apartment, he sat for a while in the dark kitchen and thought about 4 years and a tile backsplash and pasta on a Thursday. He didn't feel what he might have expected to feel. He didn't feel vindicated or hollowed out or even particularly sad. He felt something that was harder to name. A kind of settling, like the moment a building stops being under construction and starts being a building. He thought about what Malcolm had told him. You'll know when it's time. 2 weeks after that, he had a meeting in Burlington. Meridian's quarterly review was held at the company's headquarters, a glass-fronted building near the lakefront that Malcolm had designed personally, insisting on a lobby floor made from reclaimed Ontario pine. Caleb walked in through the main entrance wearing a gray blazer over a clean Henley, which was as formal as he got unless someone was getting married or buried. Dorothea met him in the lobby. Good timing, she said. Is it, he said. Fletcher's upstairs. Board's assembling now. You said you wanted to be present for the annual address this year. I did, Caleb said. He'd said it because it was time. He could feel it the way you can feel a structure settle. Not dramatic, just certain. They took the elevator to the 4th floor. Dorothea briefed him quietly in the hallway outside the boardroom. Performance numbers, a land acquisition in Barrie, a zoning challenge in Hamilton that had been resolved cleanly, the usual business of a company that was, by any measure, doing very well. Fletcher was at the head of the table when they came in. He was in the middle of a sentence, something about Q2 projections, and he paused when the door opened. His eyes moved to Dorothea first, then to Caleb. The pause lasted half a second longer than it should have. Caleb Hurst, Dorothea said, to the room generally, in the tone of someone who has been waiting to say something for a long time. Majority shareholder and trustee of the Hearst-Caldwell Family Trust, the owner of Meridian Group. The room was quiet in a particular way. Fletcher set down his pen. Caleb pulled out the chair at the opposite end of the table and sat down. He nodded at the board members, some of whom he knew, 1 or 2 he was meeting for the first time, and said simply, "Sorry I haven't been around more. I'm changing that." Fletcher's face did something complicated. His expression moved through surprise, then recalibration, then something that was trying to be professional composure and not quite getting there. He was a smart man. He understood immediately what this meant. He understood it the way you understand a foundation report that tells you the ground isn't what you thought it was. The meeting continued. Caleb stayed quiet for most of it, listening. He asked 3 questions, specific ones, technical ones, the kind that signaled to anyone paying attention that this was not a man arriving to observe, but a man who had been paying attention for a long time already. The CFO answered him directly. The board chair looked relieved in a way he was trying not to show. Fletcher answered his questions professionally. His voice didn't waver. Caleb respected him for that. After the meeting in the hallway, Fletcher caught up to him. I didn't know, Fletcher said. No, Caleb said. You weren't supposed to. There was a pause. We should talk about the transition, Fletcher said. Whatever you need from me, appreciate it, Caleb said. And he meant it. He had no quarrel with Fletcher professionally. Fletcher had run the visible parts of Meridian well for 3 years. Malcolm's instincts had been right about that. He didn't say anything about Adrienne. It wasn't the place, and it wasn't the point. He learned about it the way he'd learned about most things where Adrienne was concerned. Indirectly, 3 days later, from Dermot, who had it from Paulette, who had it from a woman in her book club, whose cousin worked at Meridian's Burlington office. Adrienne had come to pick Fletcher up from work the day of the board meeting. She'd been waiting in the lobby. She knew the building, had been there for a client meeting 2 years earlier when she still worked in development coordination. She'd been standing near the windows that looked out onto the lake, checking her phone, when the elevator opened and a group of board members came through the lobby along with Dorothea. And, behind them, Caleb. She had seen him before she processed who he was in that context. He was in a blazer. His posture was different. Or maybe the posture had always been there and she'd never noticed it because she hadn't been looking for it. He was talking to the board chair, and the board chair was listening the way people listen when the speaker is the one who matters. Someone from the board had said his name and his title. She had stood very still by the window. Caleb had walked past without looking in her direction. Not because he hadn't seen her, she thought, replaying it later that he had, but because there was nothing to say, and he had always known which things required words and which things didn't. She had waited in the lobby until Fletcher came down. He hadn't told her on the drive home. He'd been quiet in a way she recognized as the quiet of a man processing something he didn't have language for yet. She'd asked him twice if he was all right. He'd said yes both times. He told her that night after dinner. He sat across from her at the table and explained, carefully and completely, what he had understood that afternoon, that the company he ran, the one that had given him his title and his Range Rover and the condo and the ability to take her to restaurants with no prices on the menu, it belonged to Caleb Hurst. It had always belonged to Caleb Hurst. Fletcher was, in the most precise and uncomfortable sense, a very well-compensated employee. Adrienne sat with that for a long time. She thought about the apartment in Hamilton, the tile backsplash, the pasta on a Thursday, the way Caleb had looked at her across that kitchen table when she told him she wanted out. Not angry, not devastated, just calm in the way he was always calm. That steadiness she had interpreted as a lack of fire. She understood now that it wasn't absence, it was foundation. It was the kind of stillness that only belongs to someone who knows, with precision, what they've built and what they're standing on. She had left the man who owned the building to go live inside it with someone else. She didn't call Caleb. There was no version of that call she could construct that wasn't humiliating, and she was not yet humble enough to make it anyway. She stayed with Fletcher. The engagement, as far as anyone publicly knew, remained on. But something had changed. She could feel it in the weight of her own certainty, which had always been considerable, and now had a small, specific crack running through it. In the meantime, Caleb had dinner with Paulette and Dermot again, this time at a new place in Grimsby that Paulette had read about. He ordered the lake trout. Birchwood the dog was tied to the table leg and intermittently stared at him with the pure, uncomplicated affection that only dogs and very young children are capable of. He had not spent a single day of the past 8 months thinking about what Adrienne would think when she found out. He wasn't built that way. What he'd spent those 8 months doing was the same thing he'd been doing for 7 years before that. Work, learn, build. Show up where he was needed. Fix what was broken. Leave things better than he found them. That wasn't ambition, he supposed, by Adrienne's definition. But then, Adrienne's definition had never been his to live by. There was a woman at the Grimsby restaurant, a friend of Paulette's named Sawdust, who had driven down from Hamilton for the dinner, who worked in landscape architecture and had opinions about native plantings and the particular injustice of municipal bylaws around front yard gardens, and who laughed with her whole face. She sat across from Caleb and didn't ask him what he did for a living until the main course was already finished, and when he told her, just the stripped-down version, crew work, development, Niagara region, she nodded and said she'd been working on a native grassland restoration project near the Welland Canal and asked if he'd ever had to deal with contaminated site remediation in his work. He had. They talked about it for 20 minutes. Dermot fell asleep in his chair. Paulette, clearing the dessert plates, caught Caleb's eye and raised her eyebrows a fraction of an inch. He smiled. He didn't say anything. The spring smelled like wet soil and possibility, which is what spring in Ontario always smells like if you've spent enough time outside in it to know. The creek behind the Fort Erie site had settled back into its banks. The new build in Oakville had passed its framing inspection. A deal in Barrie had closed cleanly. Meridian was moving forward and Caleb was at the head of it now. Not invisibly, but not loudly either. Just there. The way a foundation is there. Not the thing you see, but the thing that makes everything else possible. He drove back to Stony Creek that night with the windows down, the late May air moving through the car, the radio on something he didn't really know but didn't turn off. He thought about Say, briefly, and then about the site meeting he had at 7 the next morning, and then about nothing in particular. The sawdust smell was still in his jacket. He'd stopped noticing it years ago, but it was there, evidence, as Adrienne had said, of where he'd been and what he'd made. She had meant it as a criticism. He had always taken it as a record.